They say a billionaire's world is made of gold, but that night I realized it was made of ice. My name is Elena. For 3 years I was the invisible girl. The one who polished the silver, scrubbed the floors, and never dared to look up. Julian Vane was my boss. The CEO of a global empire. A man who had everything, except a heart. Until one night in the silence of his kitchen he saw me. Not as a maid but as a woman. We fell in love in the shadows. Stolen kisses in the library, whispered promises in the dawn. But when I got pregnant, the fairy tale didn't just end, it exploded. His mother called me a rat. A nobody. And Julian? The man who swore he'd protect me? He watched as security dragged me to the gates with nothing but $200 and a life growing inside me. He chose his mother's empire over our child. He thought he'd never see me again. He thought I'd wither away in the dark. But 7 years later I'm back. And this time I'm not here to clean his house. I'm here to own it. Before we dive into how I brought the world's most powerful man to his knees, I want to ask you something. Have you ever been told you weren't enough? Have you ever been cast aside by someone you trusted? If you believe that strength is built in the struggle, then you belong here with us. Please hit that subscribe button right now. Help us grow this community of survivors. Your support is the fuel that keeps these stories alive. Now, let's start from the beginning. The Vane penthouse was a cathedral of glass and cold ambition. My day started at 4 a.m., before the sun even touched the Manhattan skyline. My life was measured in the rhythm of chores, the exact temperature of his morning espresso, the precise fold of his silk shirts, the silence I was required to maintain whenever he entered a room. Julian was a ghost to me. A beautiful, terrifying ghost. He moved through the house like a storm, always on a call, always calculating. I was taught never to make eye contact. To the Vanes, I wasn't a person, I was part of the furniture. But then came the night of the blackout. A summer storm had knocked out the power. The penthouse was plunged into a thick velvet darkness. I was in the kitchen lighting candles when I heard him enter. He didn't have his blazer on. His sleeves were rolled up, and for the first time he looked human. Exhausted. He sat at the island watching the flicker of the candlelight. I poured him a glass of water and went to leave, but his voice stopped me. "Stay," he said. It wasn't a command. It was a plea. I turned back, the glow of the flame dancing in his dark eyes. "With everything you have, Julian," I asked, the boldness of the dark giving me courage, "with all the billions and the towers, are you happy?" The silence stretched for a minute. He looked at me, then really looked at me. Not as a servant but as a person. "No one has ever asked me that," he whispered. "Everyone asks about the stocks, the mergers, the legacy. No one cares about the man." That night, the wall between the CEO and the maid cracked. Over the next few months, we built a secret world. We'd meet in the library at 2 a.m. He'd tell me about his dreams of being an architect, of building things that weren't just for profit. I'd tell him about my family's farm and the smell of rain on the dirt. He started leaving things for me. A book of poetry hidden behind the cleaning supplies. A vintage lace handkerchief tucked into a drawer he knew I'd open. In the dark, he was Julian. My Julian. But in the light, he was still the Vane heir. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself our love was stronger than the class divide. I was young and I was in love, and I was foolish enough to think that a billionaire would choose a girl with nothing over a world that gave him everything. Then the morning sickness started. I was dizzy while polishing the grand piano. I was nauseous while preparing his mother's tea. I knew before I even took the test. I was terrified, but a part of me was glowing. I thought, this is it. This is the bond he can't break. I imagined us telling his mother. I imagined him standing up to the board. I imagined a life where I wasn't hiding in the laundry room. But Lillian Vane didn't become the matriarch of the city by being blind. He found the test in my room while I was out running errands. When I walked back into the penthouse, I didn't see Julian. I saw Lillian standing in the center of the foyer, the pregnancy test held between her fingers like it was a piece of filth. Julian was standing behind her, his face a mask of stone. "You've been busy, haven't you, you little rat?" she spat. Her voice was cold enough to freeze the blood in my veins. "Did you think this was your lottery ticket? Did you think you could trap my son with a gutter child? I looked at Julian. My heart was screaming, say something. Tell her you love me. Tell her about the library. But he wouldn't look at me. His mother turned to him, her voice dropping into a hiss. Julian, if you acknowledge this mistake, I will strip you of every share. I will tell the board you are incompetent. I will destroy everything your father built. No. The help, or your empire. The silence lasted forever. Then Julian spoke. His voice was dead. Get her out of here. Julian. I cried out, stepping toward him, but the security guards were already there. Don't touch me, he snapped, finally looking at me. But it wasn't my Julian. It was the Ice King. Take your things and go. I'll have my lawyers send a settlement. I don't want your money. I screamed as they dragged me toward the elevator. I wanted you. They threw me out into the rain. One suitcase. $200 in an envelope tossed at my feet. The gates closed with a sound like a guillotine. I stood there, drenched and broken, realizing the man I loved was a coward. But as I touched my stomach, a new feeling took over. The love was gone. In its place was a cold, burning fire. He thought he won. He thought he'd bought my silence. But he forgot one thing: I had been watching him for years. I knew his secrets. I knew his weaknesses. And I was going to use every single one of them to destroy him. The ballroom was packed. 300 of the most powerful people in the country. Senators, tech founders, old money, and ruthless investors. They were all there for one reason: to meet the mysterious woman who had just executed the most brutal hostile takeover in Wall Street history. No one knew her name. No one had seen her face. She was a ghost who had bought the city from the shadows. Then the heavy oak doors swung open. As I walked in, draped in emerald silk and wearing diamonds that cost more than his penthouse, the room went silent. And then I heard it. The sharp crash of glass. I turned my head just enough to see him. Julian Vane. The man who had everything. He stood there, his face ashen, his hands still frozen in the air as his champagne glass shattered on the marble floor. The crowd whispered, but his eyes were locked on mine. He recognized me. 7 years ago I was his maid. 7 years ago I was carrying his child and begging for mercy. 7 years ago he threw me out on the street like garbage in the middle of a storm. Now I own every brick of his empire. I own the chair he sits in. And most importantly, I own the secret that will bring his entire world to its knees. Watching the man who broke you realize he no longer has power over you is a feeling words can't describe. If you've ever been the underdog, if you've ever had to rebuild your life from the ashes while the world watched you fail, this part of the story is for you. We are building a community of people who turn their pain into power. Smash that subscribe button and join us. Let's show them that the person they threw away is the one who comes back to lead. Now, let's see exactly how a woman with $200 became a queen. 7 years ago, the rain didn't just wash away my tears. It washed away the girl I used to be. I sat at a bus station that first night, clutching my suitcase, my hand pressed against my stomach. I had $200 and a heart that had been ripped out of my chest. I watched the lights of the Vane penthouse from a distance, a glowing tower of lies. Julian was up there, probably drinking expensive scotch, sleeping in silk sheets, while the mother of his child was shivering on a plastic bench. I didn't cry. I couldn't afford to. I moved to a small, cramped apartment in a city where no one knew the Vane name. I worked 3 jobs. I cleaned offices at night, waited tables at dawn, and spent my lunch breaks in public libraries, teaching myself the language of the people who destroyed me: finance. While other mothers were buying cribs, I was studying market trends. While I was rocking Leo to sleep in a room that smelled like old radiator steam, I was tracking Julian's company. I learned his patterns. I learned his weaknesses. I saw the mistakes he made because he was too arrogant to think anyone was watching. Leo was my fuel. Every time he asked why he didn't have a father, I'd look at his blue eyes, Julian's eyes, and I'd feel that cold fire burn a little hotter. I didn't want a settlement. I didn't want child support. I wanted the throne. I started small. A tiny investment firm. I used the knowledge I'd gained while cleaning Julian's study. The names of the clients he looked down on, the companies he thought were too small to notice. I courted them. I told them I could do what the Vanes couldn't. I could see the value in the invisible. 5 years in, I caught my big break. I predicted a market crash that Julian's experts missed. My firm, Ember Holdings, tripled its value overnight. I started buying up Vane global debt. Slowly. Quietly. Like a shadow creeping across a sundial. Julian's mother Lillian was getting older and Julian was getting desperate. He was trying to expand into green energy, overextending his reach. He needed a partner. He needed a massive influx of cash to save the family name. He put out the call for a secret investor. He wanted someone discreet. Someone who wouldn't ask too many questions. I laughed when I saw the proposal on my desk. He was inviting the wolf into the sheepfold and calling it a business deal. I signed the papers using a shell company. I watched as he unknowingly signed away his voting rights, piece by piece, just to keep his stock price from falling. He thought he was saving his legacy. In reality, he was handing me the keys to the front door. And that brings us back to tonight. The gala. I watched him walk toward me through the crowd, his steps unsteady. The Ice King looked like he was seeing a ghost. "Elena?" he whispered, his voice cracking as he reached the edge of my circle. I didn't smile. I didn't frown. I simply took a sip of my own drink and looked at him like he was a stain on the floor I had to clean. "It's Miss Petrova now, Julian," I said, my voice projecting just enough for the surrounding senators to hear. "And I believe you're standing in my light. We have a board meeting at 8 a.m. tomorrow. Try not to be late. I hate it when my employees lack punctuality." The look on his face wasn't just shock. It was the sound of a 7-year-old tower finally starting to crumble. But the best part? He still doesn't know about Leo. He thinks this is about money. He has no idea that the real debt he owes hasn't even been presented yet. The air in the Vane Global boardroom was so thick you could taste the fear. For 50 years, a Vane had sat at the head of this table. But this morning the locks had been changed. The passwords had been reset. Julian sat there watching the door, his hands trembling slightly. He thought he was here to negotiate. He thought he could charm his way back into my good graces, or maybe buy me off like he tried to do 7 years ago. Then the doors opened. I didn't walk in alone. I walked in with my legal team, a wall of black suits and briefcases. I took my seat at the head of the table, his father's seat, and tossed a single folder in front of him. It wasn't a merger agreement. It wasn't a bank statement. It was a birth certificate. I watched the color drain from his face as his eyes hit the name at the bottom. Leo Julian Vane. Date of birth. 7 months after I was tossed into the rain. The room went dead silent. The board members looked at each other in shock, but Julian looked like he had been struck by lightning. He realized in that second that I didn't just own his buildings. I owned the only thing left of his soul. There is no weapon in the world more powerful than the truth. Julian spent 7 years building a wall of money to hide behind, but he forgot that walls can be torn down by the very people they were built to keep out. If you're enjoying this journey of justice and reclamation, make sure you're subscribed. We're telling stories for everyone who was told they were nothing, only to become everything. Join our community. Now, let's see what happens when the Ice King finally shatters. Julian didn't look at the board members. He didn't look at the lawyers. He only looked at me, his eyes searching mine for a lie that wasn't there. "You had a son," he whispered, his voice so thin it barely carried across the table. "I have a son." "No, Julian," I said, leaning forward, my voice cold and precise. "I had a son. You had a stock portfolio. You had a penthouse. You had your mother's approval. You don't get to claim the child you tried to pay to disappear." One of the older board members cleared his throat. "Miss Petrova, this is a private matter, but we are here to discuss the transition of power." "The transition is over," I snapped, turning my gaze on him. "I own 51% of the voting shares. My first act as chairperson is to remove Julian Vane from all executive duties, effective immediately. Security will escort him from the building. He has 10 minutes to clear his desk." Julian stood up so fast his chair screeched against the floor. "Elena, wait. Please. We need to talk. Not about the company. About him. About Leo." "There is nothing to talk about," I said, standing up to meet his height. You chose a side 7 years ago. You chose the gates. You chose the $200. Now you get to live with that choice. You're dismissed, Mr. Vane. I watched him walk out. He didn't look like the titan of industry anymore. He looked like a ghost. But my victory felt hollow for a moment when I saw Lillian Vane standing in the hallway. She looked older, her face a mask of bitter pride, but when she saw me, that same venom returned to her eyes. You think you've won? She hissed as I walked past. You're just a maid playing dress-up. My son will find a way back. A Vane always does. I stopped and looked her directly in the eye. Lillian, I'm not playing dress-up. I bought your house this morning. I'll have your things moved to the sidewalk by noon. I suggest you find a very comfortable suitcase. I went home that night to the penthouse I now owned. Leo was playing on the floor with his toy trucks. He looked up at me with those blue eyes, those Vane eyes, and smiled. Did you win today, Mommy? He asked. I knelt down and pulled him into a hug, breathing in the scent of his hair. Yes, Leo. I won. But later that night there was a knock at my door. Not the service entrance. The front door. I opened it to find Julian. He was soaking wet, the rain lashing down just like it did the night he threw me out. He wasn't wearing a suit. He was wearing an old sweater, looking exactly like the man I had fallen in love with in the library at 2 a.m. He didn't try to push his way in. He just stood there shivering. I don't want the company back, Elena, he said, his voice breaking. I don't care about the towers. Just let me see him. Let me see my son. I'll sign anything. I'll disappear. Just let me look at him once. I looked at the man who had broken me. For 7 years I had dreamt of this moment. I had dreamt of him begging. But now that he was here, I realized that vengeance wasn't as sweet as I thought. Because looking at him, I didn't just see my enemy. I saw the father of the boy sleeping in the other room. 1 hour, I said, stepping aside. You have 1 hour. And Julian, if you ever mention the Vane name to him, I will make sure you never see the sun again. I had spent 2,555 days imagining Julian Vane in pain. I wanted him to feel the cold I felt. I wanted him to feel the hunger, the shame, and the crushing weight of being alone. But as he stood in the doorway of my son's bedroom, soaking wet and stripped of his billions, I didn't feel the triumph I expected. Julian didn't move. He didn't speak. He just stared at the boy who had his face, his eyes, and his name. Leo looked up from his book, tilted his head, and asked the one question I wasn't prepared for. Are you the man from the pictures in Mommy's locked box? Julian collapsed to his knees right there on the carpet. Not because he was defeated by a hostile takeover, but because he was realized that while he was busy building skyscrapers, he had missed the only thing that actually mattered. He reached out a hand, then pulled it back, afraid he would shatter the vision. This was the Ice King, humbled by a 7-year-old in dinosaur pajamas. The silence in the room was heavy, broken only by the sound of the rain against the glass. Julian stayed on his knees, his head bowed. He looked smaller than I'd ever seen him. I'm a friend of your mother's, Leo, Julian finally choked out, his voice thick with unshed tears. Leo hopped off the bed and walked toward him with the fearless curiosity I had raised him to have. He stopped a foot away from Julian. Why are you crying? Did you get in trouble? Julian looked up, and for the first time I saw the man I had loved in the library. The man without the mask. Yes, Leo, he whispered. I got in very big trouble. I made a mistake a long time ago and I've been lost ever since. I stood in the shadows of the doorway, my arms crossed, my heart a battlefield. I wanted to scream at him to leave. I wanted to tell Leo the truth, that this man had valued a bank account over his existence. But seeing Julian's hand finally touch Leo's shoulder, a gentle, reverent touch, I felt my anger waver. 1 hour is up, Julian, I said, my voice firmer than I felt. Julian stood up slowly. He looked at Leo one last time, a look of such profound agony and love that it stayed with me long after he left. He walked back into the living room, but he didn't head for the door. He turned to me. I know you hate me, Elena. You have every right to. But my mother, she isn't finished, Julian warned, his eyes turning sharp. She's been talking to the old board members. She's trying to file a custody suit based on your unstable past when you left the estate. She wants to use Leo to get the company back. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the rain. She wouldn't dare. She would, Julian said. She's desperate. But I'm the only witness to what happened that night. I'm the only one who can testify that she forced you out. I'm the only one who can stop her from taking him. And what's the price, Julian? I spat. You want your CEO chair back? You want 10% of the shares. Julian stepped closer, his face inches from mine. I don't want a single cent. I want to be the man you asked me to be 7 years ago. I want to be the one who stands up to her. Let her sue you. Let her bring it to court. I will testify against her. I will tell the world that the Vane legacy is built on a lie. I will destroy my own reputation to save Leo's future. I looked at him, searching for the trick. But all I saw was a man who had finally realized that his mother's approval was a poison. Why now? I asked. Why didn't you do this then? Because then I was a coward who thought I needed a throne to be a king, Julian said, reaching out to touch the heavy emerald necklace I wore, the one I'd bought with the money from his company. But tonight, seeing him, I realized I'd rather be a nobody with a son than a billionaire in an empty tower. Just then my phone buzzed. It was an emergency alert from the office. The Vane global servers were being wiped. A digital sabotage. Lillian wasn't waiting for a courtroom. She was burning the empire down so I couldn't have it. She's destroying the company, I whispered, staring at the screen. Julian grabbed his jacket, his eyes burning with a cold, familiar fire. Let her burn the money, Elena. We have the boy. And if she wants a war, we'll give her one she can't afford. The world thought I was finished. They saw the news reports of the Vane global collapse. They saw the stock price plummet as Lillian Vane tried to burn the empire to the ground just to keep it out of my hands. But she forgot one thing. I wasn't that scared girl in the kitchen anymore. And Julian? He wasn't her puppet. The courtroom doors creaked open as we walked in, not as enemies but as a united front. Lillian didn't even look at me. She looked at her son, her eyes full of a mother's betrayal. You would choose her again, she hissed. After she stole everything? Julian didn't hesitate. He sat next to me, took my hand in front of the judge, the cameras and the world, and spoke the words that finally ended a 30-year war. She didn't steal it, Mother. I gave it to her. Because the only thing you ever gave me was a cage. That was the moment I realized the Ice King was dead. And in his place, a man had finally been born. The courtroom was a battlefield of paper and pride. Lillian's lawyers had spent the morning trying to paint me as a gold-digging opportunist who had manipulated a vulnerable Julian. They pulled out my old employment records, my bank statements from when I lived in the slums, trying to shame me for my poverty. But I sat there with my head held high. I didn't hide from my past. I wore it like armor. Then Julian was called to the stand. The room went so quiet you could hear the heartbeat of everyone in it. Lillian leaned forward, a confident smirk on her face. She was sure her son would never commit social suicide by telling the truth. Mr. Vane, the judge began. Did Elena Petrova manipulate you into a relationship to secure your family's assets? Julian looked at his mother. Then he looked at me. And finally he looked at Leo, who was sitting in the back with my assistant. No, Julian said, his voice echoing with a power that shook the room. I was the one who manipulated her. I was the one who held the power. I invited her into my life, and when she told me she was pregnant, I allowed my mother to throw her into the street. I stood by and watched as the woman I loved was humiliated because I was too weak to walk away from my inheritance. The gallery gasped. Lillian's face turned a violent shade of purple. Julian, be quiet, she screamed, but the judge hammered his gavel. My mother didn't just fire a maid, Julian continued, ignoring the outbursts. She tried to buy a human soul. She offered me $1 billion to forget my son. And for 7 years I lived with that cowardice. But no more. I relinquish all claims to the Vane Trust. I testify that Elena Petrova is the only person fit to lead this company and the only person fit to raise our son. The case collapsed in minutes. By the time we walked out of that courtroom, Lillian Vane was a woman without an ally. The board of directors, seeing the public's reaction, voted to remove her entirely. She was left with the one thing she feared most: irrelevance. As we reached the courthouse steps, Lillian caught up to us. Her hands were shaking. "You'll regret this, Julian," she whispered. "You have nothing now. No title. No money. Nothing." Julian looked at her, then he looked at me, and finally he picked up Leo. "For the first time in my life, Mother. I have everything." We didn't go back to the penthouse. We went to a small park in the center of the city, a place where no one knew our names. We sat on a bench watching Leo run toward a group of kids playing soccer. "What now?" I asked, looking at the man who had lost $1 billion legacy in a single afternoon. "Now." Julian smiled, and it was a real warm smile that reached his eyes. "Now I believe I'm looking for a job. I hear the CEO of Ember Holdings is a very tough boss, but she has a heart for people with complicated resumes." I laughed, the weight of 7 years finally lifting off my shoulders. I reached into my bag and pulled out $200, the same amount that had been tossed at my feet all those years ago. I handed it to him. "Consider this your signing bonus," I said. Julian took the money, tucked it into his pocket, and kissed me. It wasn't a secret kiss in a library. It wasn't a desperate kiss in the rain. It was the kiss of two equals, building a new empire out of the ruins of the old one. The maid was a mogul. The billionaire was a father. And the secret in the shadows was finally standing in the light. Thanks for watching.